Have you ever been slapped by your own child? Not just across the face, but across all the years you dedicated to them. I'm Clara Bennett. All my life, I believed that if I was just patient enough, if I sacrificed enough, my family would stay intact. I cooked warm, bountiful dinners, and I kept the porch light on every single night, waiting for the sound of my children's cars returning home. I called that love. Until the day I realized, love can't save someone who has forgotten how to respect the person giving it. That night, my child told me I should move out. The door closed and the porch light went out. For the first time in 30 years, I sat in the darkness, listening to my heart beat slow. And then I thought, if they turn off my light, I'll just turn my own back on. I left the old house in the misty Vermont dawn, carrying only one bare light bulb and a fragile belief that there was still a place for a mother to start over. I'm not telling this story for pity. I'm telling it so that anyone who has ever lost everything understands that sometimes you have to lose everything to finally find yourself. Here, in this place, I'm going to tell you about the cracks, about how we mend them with light, with kindness, and with the sheer endurance of a heart that simply refuses to break. If you've ever gone through a winter of your own, if you are learning how to switch the light back on in the darkness, stay with me. Subscribe to this channel because here, every story is not just told, it's lived again with the conviction that no matter how long the night, a tiny light is always enough to guide you back home. A Vermont morning always has a distinct smell. The scent of damp wood, the cold breath of the lake, the old iron from the porch railing. I pulled back the curtain, and the mist rushed in, a cold that bit at the skin. The wooden house by the lake stood still, as if holding its breath. Every time the floorboards creaked, I remembered my husband saying, "Let it creak. It's just your heart still beating." We pieced together every plank and every board, by hand, through long winters. Even now, I still trace the grain of the wood, listening to the murmur of old memories. Outside, the lake was flat as a mirror. A thin layer of mist lay over the water, shimmering as the sun just peeked through. I placed my cup of coffee on the windowsill, its rising steam weaving into the damp air. In that quiet stillness, I whispered, "This is where we learned how to stay, when everything else wanted to leave." As evening fell, I turned on the porch light again for Samuel. No one ever told me to stop the habit, and I never needed a reason to keep it. The golden glow struck the window pane, reflecting my silhouette, a little tremor running through me in the breeze. Some nights, the snow was so thick the road was empty, nothing but the rustle of the woods. But the porch light always stayed on. It illuminated the small crack in the wooden step and cast its glow upon the wall filled with family frames. I would still whisper, like a prayer, "Mom is still waiting up." When Samuel was little, he used to run out onto the porch, point at the bulb, and exclaim, "Mom, it's our little son!" Now, 38, he rarely came home, and when he did, sometimes he'd just stop by and vanish again, like a passing stranger. I stopped asking. For me, waiting had simply become the quietest form of love. Inside the kitchen, Amber, my daughter-in-law, was often busy. She was neat, beautiful, and as sharp as the city apartments she loved. As I poured tea, she looked at the porcelain teapot on the table and offered a faint, dismissive smile. "Mom, it's so outdated." I laughed, though I knew my smile hid nothing. "Perhaps, but the tea in an old pot stays warm longer, doesn't it?" She didn't answer, only smoothing her hair, her finger brushing against the bright, oversized ring she wore. I looked around the kitchen, a place that once held Samuel's piano practice and my husband's laughter, and now there was only the sharp, cold sound of a knife hitting the cutting board. Amber liked to change everything. The flowers, the curtains, even how I folded the kitchen towels. She said she wanted to modernize it, but I knew she wasn't just talking about the house. She wanted to replace the past itself, the very thing I was still clinging to, if only as the faint warmth of that old porch light. I brewed another pot of tea, setting it on the table between us. The thin steam rose, quickly dissolving into the meaningless air. Amber opened her phone, scrolling through the news. I watched the cold light from the screen reflect on her face. In that single moment, I realized I was sitting between two very different kinds of light. One was technological, stark, and emotionless. The other, a fragile but true golden warmth from the waiting porch light outside. I chose to look toward the door. Snow had begun to fall in scattered flakes. The golden glow still flickered like an old heart refusing to rest, and I thought, perhaps, waiting is never outdated if you still believe in your own light. The dinner was warm but tense. The fireplace crackled, trying to fill the void, but it couldn't drown out the dry, stark sound of forks hitting plates. The slightly bitter scent of burnt cheese spread through the room, stinging the bridge of my nose. I poured more wine, hoping to ease the heaviness in the air. Samuel looked down at his plate, silent. Amber sliced the cold cuts with a gleaming knife, her movement precise and final, as if controlling the conversation without needing to speak. I asked casually, "Is work still going well, Sam?" He nodded, his eyes hiding in the shadow of the overhead light. "It's fine, Mom. Just tired." Amber interjected, her voice light but with the chilling drop of an icicle. "His company is restructuring. Everyone's worried." The statement sounded like a warning, not a piece of sharing. I nodded, trying to smile, then poured her more water. "Well, I'll pray for everything to settle down." Amber gave a thin smile, her eyes glancing around the house. I knew she was calculating, measuring, comparing. In that moment, I realized the kitchen, once the heart of this house, was now just a room with a temperature. I stabbed my fork into the meat pie. The cheese was burnt on the edges, bitter. The clock on the wall ticked, talked, as if measuring the rhythm of the tension. Samuel spoke softly, almost apologetically. "I think we should repaint the house, Mom. Make it a little brighter." I went silent. Brighter meant erasing all the old colors. The photographs, the cabinet, the warm yellow light they always called gloomy. I managed to smile because if I didn't, the tears would fall. Dinner ended quietly. Amber cleared the table quickly, efficiently, before I even had a chance to thank her. I stood and watched their two backs disappear up the staircase, straight, cold, and parallel. All that was left was the soft clatter of dishes in the sink. I washed them one by one. The water was warm, but my hands were freezing. As I dried the last glass, the porch light shone through the window. A thin golden strip fell across my hands, trembling slightly, yet still strong. I believed that love held a home together. That belief was old-fashioned, but it was the only thing I had left. All families weather the storm, I reassured myself. I remembered the years when my husband was alive. We used to have arguments as fierce as the seasonal gales, but once the storm passed, he was always the first person to fix the porch light. The boat might burn out, but as long as we have a home, we keep turning it on. Now it was just me and that light. I opened the door and stepped out onto the porch. It was colder than I thought. A thick layer of fog covered the lake. The wind swept in from afar, carrying the damp scent of pine. I pulled my woolen scarf tighter around my neck and stood there, looking at the light. The porch light was on. the belief was still there. The golden glow settled in my eyes, shivering in the mist, but it did not go out. I put my hand on my chest, feeling my cheeks warm from the golden reflection. My heart felt peaceful. They might change everything, the curtains, the wall color, even the memories hanging on these walls. But as long as I had the strength to flip the switch, this house still had a soul. I watched the light slowly spread across the snow like a gentle breath. Inside, the sound of their footsteps faded away, and out on the porch there was just me, the wind, and the small lamp, patiently telling its own story in the quietest language on earth. The morning in the kitchen felt completely different. The coffee scent was no longer rich as it used to be. Instead, there was the smell of floor cleaner and new plastic. I stood by the doorway, watching Amber reorganize the kitchen, drawer by drawer, with the orderly precision of someone decorating a showroom. She opened a cabinet, pulling out things I had kept for decades: the copper kettle my husband used to polish by hand, the jar that held the spoons, with the small chip Samuel made when he dropped it at age 6. She didn't see them as memories, just clutter. "Mom, this is all corroded," Amber said it in a flat, emotionless voice. She dropped it into the trash bin, the lid snapping shut with a crisp clop, like the closing of a memory box. I blinked, as if the sound had just cut through the stream of my own recollection. I wanted to say, "That belonged to your father," but I knew that sentence meant nothing to them anymore. She realigned the vinegar bottle, wiping the counter surface with a white cloth, moving in perfect, neat circles. "I think we should replace the gas stove. This one wastes too much energy." I nodded lightly. "Whatever you two decide." The words came out easier than I expected, but immediately after, my throat felt parched. She continued organizing. I sat down at the table, listening to the objects clanking against each other. Cups, bowls, the salt shaker, all emitting short, sharp sounds, without the familiar resonance. It was as if the house was learning how to be silent, too. In the afternoon, the snow melted into a thin mist. I lit the porch lamp earlier than usual. The golden light reflected on the glass, hazy and out of place against the bright white light of the kitchen. My light and their light were not the same temperature. It was late when Samuel finally returned, the sound of his engine sputtering and dying in the driveway. The door opened, and the draft that rushed in carried the unfamiliar scent of cigarettes, not the kind he used to smoke. I caught a glimpse of ash clinging to the sleeve of his coat. "Have you eaten?" I asked. He shrugged off his jacket, put his keys on the counter, and avoided my gaze. "I'm tired, Mom. We can talk tomorrow." The way he spoke made me feel colder than the wind outside. Samuel didn't look around, didn't ask about dinner, and didn't touch the cup of tea I had poured for him. He went straight upstairs, his footsteps heavy and rushed. I stayed seated, listening to every sound dissolve into the empty kitchen. On the table, the cup of tea grew cold faster than on any other night. I reached out and touched the rim, the chill spreading all the way to my wrist. For the first time in years, I didn't know what I should do to keep my son close. Night fell. The porch light cast a single, trembling golden streak onto the wall. I thought about turning it off early, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. Because if the light went out, how would Samuel know I was still waiting? A low murmur from upstairs made me look up. Amber's voice was deep, faint, but loud enough for me to catch a few words. "Can't continue like this. Sell the house." I held my breath. The word "sell" fell from their lips, as light as a sigh, but inside me, it dropped like a stone into the lake. The imaginary sound echoed, low, deep, reverberating, then finally sinking away. I backed up into my chair, looking up at the ceiling where the light reflected. The wall, the wooden roof, the picture frames, everything seemed to be awaiting judgment. I didn't cry. I just felt a void open up in my chest. a space where the winter wind could now pass through without asking permission. Outside, the porch light was still on, struggling to reach out through the fog to find someone. But perhaps tonight, no one was coming home. I stood before the door to their room. A thin sliver of light shone out into the hallway, mingling with the scent of old wood and the lingering warmth of dinner. I knocked, 3 gentle, polite taps, like a stranger. No one answered. I heard a sound inside, a soft fall of an object, then absolute silence. Maybe a cup, maybe a quickly swallowed voice. I waited, my heart filling with a mix of shame and fear, as if I were the one who had erred by approaching them. My hand froze in the air, unsure whether to knock again or retreat. Finally, I took a step back. The light spilling from the crack beneath the door instantly went dark, quick and cold. I stood in the shadows, listening only to the steady beating of my own heart, each pulse counting down the years I had lost. I returned to the kitchen. The space felt both familiar and distant. The chair I usually sat in was slightly moved, as if someone had accidentally brushed against it. I placed my hand on the tabletop, my fingers tracing meaningless circles on the old wood grain. I couldn't sleep that night. I took the leather-bound notebook from the drawer, a journal that had been silent for 10 years, and opened the first page. The pen trembled slightly, the ink flowing unevenly. I wrote the first entry in a decade. If they turn off the light, what light do I have left? The word light smeared as a small drop fell onto it. I wasn't sure if it was ink or a tear. I closed the notebook, hearing the soft rub of the leather, like the closing of a room inside my heart. I stood up and went out onto the porch. The Vermont wind sliced through the air, chilling but clarifying. Above me, clouds drifted slowly. Below, the lamp remained golden, persistent, like a silent vow I had made to myself. The light was still on, but it only shone on me. The light poured onto the railing, through the pine trees, and faded into the dense obscurity. In that solitary glow, I saw myself, small, but still standing tall. Loneliness has a shape and a color. It is not black. It is the yellow of the porch light, mixed with the gray of the fog, and a faint blue of a belief that has not yet died. I sat down on the wooden steps, holding the now cold cup of tea. A single dry leaf fell at my feet, spinning, as if looking for a place to rest. Inside the house, there was absolute stillness. No voices, no footsteps. Only the golden light reflecting on the window glass, blinking softly whenever the wind stirred. I stared until everything before my eyes blurred, leaving only that trembling light, fragile yet faithful. Perhaps every love must eventually be tested by the darkness, and maybe I had reached that threshold, where one must learn to stand in their own shadow without fear. I whispered softly, as if speaking to someone in the wind, "I'm still here." Then I stood up, turned, and went back inside, leaving the lamp behind me, a long streak of light cutting across the night. The wind began to pick up early that afternoon. Thick clouds rolled in, covering half the lake, and the pine branches outside on the porch bent low, trying to maintain their balance. I put more logs into the fireplace, the flickering flames reflecting on the window pane. Meanwhile, Amber was setting the table, white tablecloths, scented candles, and crystal glasses that shone with a cold brilliance. "I have a few friends coming over tonight," she said, her voice light and airy. "They work in real estate investment." I paused. The phrase investment friends did not belong in this house, but I said nothing. I just watched her polite smile, her steel-cold eyes as she adjusted the placement of every single glass. Everything was perfectly arranged, yet it lacked one thing: warmth. I changed into a dark wool dress, refastening the loose wooden button at my wrist. When the guests arrived, the kitchen burst to life with laughter. A middle-aged man shook my hand, his eyes quickly sweeping across the house as if calculating its worth. Amber introduced me. "This is my mother-in-law, the owner of the house." "A pleasure," he said, his voice smooth. "I've heard so much about this lakeside property." I smiled, trying to appear gracious. "Oh, few people still appreciate old wooden houses in this area." "Not necessarily," he replied, sipping his wine. "With this prime location, if you transfer the title soon, my firm can close the deal within a few weeks." My fork froze mid-air. Transfer what title? No one answered immediately. The wind outside howled fiercely, making the candles on the table flicker. Amber glanced quickly at Samuel. He avoided my eyes, then slowly placed his wineglass back down on the table. "Mom, I meant to tell you, you must have forgotten," he began, his voice barely a whisper. "Last year, I had you sign some papers to reduce property taxes. It was just a formality." I was stunned. The papers last year. I remembered them clearly. A thick stack, with lots of small print. Samuel just told me to sign in the bottom corner. "Just a tax adjustment," he had said. I had signed without hesitation because I had always trusted my son. I looked over at Amber. She was pouring wine for the guest, her smile unchanged. Amidst the laughter, the clinking of silverware, and the sound of the wind outside, everything suddenly became distorted, as if the room were tipping. "Are you saying," I spoke, my voice hoarse, "that the house is no longer in my name?" Samuel pressed his lips together. Amber cut in, her voice sweet. "Mom, everything is for the common good. I just wanted to relieve you of the tax burden. It's still your home, spiritually speaking." Spiritually speaking. I repeated the phrase in my head. It sounded like a sophisticated way to justify a theft. The wind whistled through the door crack, causing the curtain to sway violently. I felt the scent of damp pine needles and cold smoke fill the room, infiltrating every breath. One candle went out. The atmosphere changed color. I looked around the table. They were talking, laughing, discussing contracts, profits, and an easy transition. And I sat there, like an unknown guest in my own home. I silently placed my fork down. My fingers still trembled slightly because of the draft through the door, or perhaps because of something else, something colder than the winter outside. "You said I forgot," I quietly replied, "but there are things I never thought I had to remember. Because trusting you was enough." No one said a word. The clock on the wall ticked, talked, slow and heavy, like a final judgment. I looked out the window. The porch light was flickering in the wind. At the dinner table, the conversation resumed. The clinking of glasses sounded like shards of glass breaking inside my heart. Before I could react, Amber continued, her voice so gentle it was almost soothing. "Don't worry, Mom. Once everything is finalized, we'll prepare a small room for you in our new apartment in Burlington. It's closer to downtown, much easier to manage your care." A small room. The phrase was as light as a cloud, but it landed in my heart as heavy as a stone. This kitchen used to be the center of my entire world, where I taught my son to make soup, mended his shirts, and arranged flowers every Sunday morning. And now, I was being granted a corner to occupy, like a footnote in my own life story. I looked around. The wooden walls my husband and I had painted by hand now reflected the cold, white light of the new fixtures. The scent of vanilla candles mingled with the alcohol fumes, cloying and false. I heard myself give a small, broken laugh deep in my throat. A small room. That will be fine. I just hope it's big enough for the old porch light. No one replied. I felt myself shrinking in my own kitchen, like a photograph forced into a frame too small, leaving no air to breathe. Outside, the wind howled. The glass door rattled softly, the curtain swaying like a shallow gasp. Inside, glasses clinked, a jarring, sharp sound like splintering fragments, cold and brittle. Amber raised her glass, her voice ringing clear. To new beginnings! The people around the table echoed the sentiment. The cheers blended with the sound of the wind. I was the only one who didn't lift my glass. I looked at the red wine in the glass before me, the only light still reflecting in the room. Amber's smile was reflected in the deep red wine. I watched it shimmer, distorted, red like a warning sign. A color too beautiful to trust, too brilliant not to hurt the eye. I remembered my husband's words when he was alive. Never let anyone replace the switch to your own light. Back then, I didn't understand. Now I understood all too well. They didn't need to touch the switch. They just needed to make me believe I no longer had the right to turn anything on or off. The wind outside intensified, sweeping across the porch, making the light flicker violently. The golden glow pulsed repeatedly, falling on the table, on the wineglass, on my tightly clenched hand. I was afraid that light would go out before I could say anything. Amber, I spoke up, soft but clear. If you sell this house, do you know what you're selling? She looked up, her lips still curved. A wooden house by the lake, Mom. That's all. I nodded, as if in acceptance, but inside my heart a different flame had just ignited. I understood. If I let them proceed, I would disappear along with this house. The guests left late that evening. Samuel said nothing more, avoiding my gaze. Amber closed the door, switched off the overhead light, leaving only the dim glow from the porch filtering through the glass. I sat alone in the kitchen, listening to the wind roar around the roof, and realized that the real storm had never been outside. There was no sound of slamming, no collision, just the morning after the storm, when everything looked deceptively peaceful. I was doing the dishes when I heard Amber speak, her voice even, soft, yet every word landed like a hard pebble. You should be grateful to still be here. I stopped, the water dripping from the plate slowing down like time itself. No one hit me, but their words hurt worse. I turned around and saw her standing by the counter, holding a newspaper open to the real estate section. The light from the window fell across her face, making it as white and blank as unwritten paper. Grateful? I repeated, as quietly as the wind. Yes, she replied, because we are still letting you stay, at least until we find a better place. The comment made the room shrink. The ticking of the wall clock sounded unusually loud. I looked around. The family photos were now covered in a layer of dust. The dried flower arrangement on the shelf was leaning slightly, as if leaning towards the weaker person. Samuel remained silent. He sat at the dining table, the coffee in his cup already cold. I waited for him to speak up. Just one sentence. Amber, don't say that. But he didn't. He looked down at his shoes, as if counting the stitches on the toe. Sam, I called, just a whisper, but my voice was hoarse. Do you think I should be grateful? He didn't answer. The silence stretched so long that I could hear the wind whistling on the porch and the faint clinking of the dishware against the sink. Finally, he only said, I don't want to argue, Mom. Please, let's not start this morning like that. The sentence sounded like a door slamming shut. I turned back to the sink, trying to finish the dish, but the water was cold and the grease clung stubbornly. Some things, no matter how hard you try to wash them, will never come clean, like the shame that had just slipped past my heart. That afternoon I did the laundry, cooked, and kept myself small, like a shadow. The chores that once made me feel useful were now just a way to hide. The washing machine spun, a weary, repetitive cycle, like the life I was trapped in. I folded the clothes, stacking them neatly, organizing every towel by color. No one asked me to, but it was the only thing I could control. From the laundry room window, I looked out at the porch. The light was still hanging there, the wire swaying slightly in the wind. I thought about the word grateful that Amber had used this morning. Grateful for being allowed to stay in the house I built? Grateful for being silenced in my own life? I turned on the dryer, the humming sound masking the inner turmoil. In that artificial warmth, one thing became perfectly clear. Gratitude cannot exist where one has to ask permission to breathe. Night fell. The cold seeped into every crack, making the floorboards groan as if protesting something. I put on a thick wool sweater and stepped out onto the porch. I stood beneath the trembling porch light. The wind blew backward, bringing the scent of snow and pine resin. The gust hit my collar, making me shiver, but I stood still, clutching a warm cup of tea. The golden light gently wavered, then steadied again. I still had it on. In the wind, I heard a sound. I wasn't sure if it was a tree branch or my own heart breaking into small pieces. From the window, the white light in the kitchen still blazed. Amber and Samuel were talking about something. I couldn't make out the words, only saw their shadows moving, growing larger then smaller, like a silent play. The house that was once a home had become a stage, and I was the audience standing on the porch, pushed back by the wind with every gust. I turned to go back inside. On the table was the brown leather notebook, still open to the unfinished page from the night before. I sat down and picked up the pen. My hand was still cold, but my handwriting was steadier than ever. I wrote, "Love without respect is slavery." When I finished, I paused, staring at the blue ink soaking into the paper like blood. Slow, thick, and indelible. I realized I had lived too long in a love mixed with servitude, and people can confuse the two until they can no longer distinguish between kindness and fear. I closed the notebook, hearing the gentle snap of the leather spine. I stepped out onto the porch once more. The sky was dense with clouds, not a single star. The lake in front of the house was pitch black, its surface like a mirror reflecting nothing anymore. I looked up at the porch light. That light was weak but persistent, clearly illuminating my face, tired, lined, but unbroken. I reached out and touched the light bulb, feeling the slight warmth. Then I placed my hand on the switch. If they turn it off, I'll turn it on myself. My voice was hoarse, but loud enough for only me to hear. A small vow made in the cold night, with only the wind and the light as witnesses. The porch light shone steadily again, casting my shadow long across the wooden floor. I looked into the profound darkness ahead of me and understood that sometimes the hardest slaps leave no mark, but it is precisely from them that one learns how to stand up. I closed the door, the golden light sliding across the wooden threshold, tracing a streak of brightness on the edge of my clothing. And in that moment, for the first time in years, I realized I was no longer afraid of the dark. The evening started with distant thunder, then rain. The first drops hit the window pane, tapping a rhythm for what was about to happen. I was checking the electricity meter. The numbers flashed continuously, a sharp red light blinking. "That's strange," I said, trying to keep my voice neutral. "The bill this month is doubled. Could it be the heater?" Samuel was sitting at the dining table, his laptop open, the blue screen reflecting off his tense face. He didn't look up. "Mom, I already told you, don't worry about that anymore." But the debit card is still in my name, I replied softly. He slammed his laptop shut, the sound a crisp, heavy thud. Don't interfere, Mom. Samuel slammed his hand on the table. The sound resonated through the room like a crack spreading. The glass of water on the table trembled. The spoon in my hand dropped, hitting the floor with a dry metallic clatter. I looked at my son, the same person who used to tremble after falling off his bicycle at 7, now standing there, his shoulders rigid, his eyes burning with anger. I didn't answer. I only listened to my heartbeat, slow, then fast, then erratic. The rain outside intensified. The wind lashed against the porch. The golden light flickered, as if it too was afraid. I picked up the spoon, hastily wiped the water on the floor, trying to do something normal to soothe the chaos in my chest. But before I could stand straight, Amber spoke up. Her voice was steady, not loud, but clear, and enough to bring everything in the room to a halt. It's time for you to move out. Those words ripped through the air. They fell into the middle of the kitchen, blending with the sound of the rain, cold and absolute. I looked at her, then at Samuel. No one avoided anyone's gaze anymore, but no one dared to look too long either. I didn't ask why. I just felt the wind seeping through the unlatched doorframe, carrying the chill of the rainwater. I smiled, a smile that didn't quite form. Move out? I repeated, my voice barely a whisper. Yes, she said. I think it's the best thing for everyone. I heard in that sentence not a suggestion, but a decision that had already been settled. The wind picked up sharply, extinguishing the candles. The flames died completely. The door slammed shut. The sound rang like a hammer striking metal, echoing through the walls. The walls trembled. My heart was hollow. In that moment, I understood. The storm outside was only an echo of the real storm, the one raging inside the human heart. I sank onto a chair, gripping the edge of the table to keep myself from shaking. Everything in the house, the refrigerator's hum, the clock's tick, even the sound of breathing, became alien. The home I had built to hold love now echoed like an abandoned room. The rain grew heavier. I looked up at the porch light. The light flickered, clinging to the darkness like a soul refusing to leave its body. I whispered, "Don't go out, please, not tonight." But the light kept swaying, as if everything was slowly slipping out of my control. A faint click sounded, small but enough to make me startle. The golden light by the door blinked repeatedly, then the porch light went out completely. For the first time in 30 years, the house was plunged into darkness. No one inside noticed, or perhaps they pretended not to see. Samuel walked up the stairs, his shoulders slumped. Amber washed the glasses, the water overflowing, but her eyes were empty. And I stood still in the living room, looking out at the pitch-black window frame as if someone had just pulled the curtain of night down without warning. The darkness rushed in like floodwater. It spilled across the floor, soaked into the walls, and crept even into the spaces between my heartbeats. Everything familiar, the table, the picture frame, the wooden chair, suddenly dissolved into blurred alien shapes. I heard the wind shriek outside, hammering against the door, as if trying to break in. I intended to step out and flip the light switch back on, but my legs wouldn't move. A wave of cold sensation ran down my spine, slow and deep, to the point where I thought my skin might crack. I didn't cry. The tears wouldn't fall, just numbness. My hands were shaking, my mouth dry, my lips salty like the lake spray. Every memory flooded back, the winters 20 years ago when my husband and I stood together on the porch, laughing at the falling snow. Back then, that small golden light was enough to make us believe we could weather any storm. Now, the same wind blew, but no one stood beside me. I walked slowly to the door, opened it slightly, and the cold air hit my face. The light wasn't broken, it was only switched off. Perhaps someone had flipped the circuit breaker, or maybe I had simply forgotten to turn it back on. But in that moment, I realized the most important thing. No one was going to turn it on for me. I sat up straight. My breathing was even, slow. Before me was the night, thick, dense, and unforgiving. But deep inside, a tiny spark had just ignited. No one is going to save me but me. I spoke softly, as if signing a treaty with myself. The voice dissolved into the air, but I knew it would stay, clinging to the walls, in my hair, in my blood. I walked out onto the porch, reaching for the switch. The wind blew so hard the roof of the porch shook. My hand was freezing, but I flipped it anyway. A distinct click, and then the light came on, faintly at first, then steady, a golden warmth like the heart of a small candle flame. I looked around. Snow was falling in scattered flakes, and the lake in the distance shimmered faintly in the light. Inside, the house remained absolutely silent, but out on the porch, I saw my own reflection again, small, tired, but alive and standing firm. The light fell onto my hair, reflecting in the glass of the door. I gently touched my chest, feeling my heartbeat slow down, no longer erratic, no longer fearful. That night, I understood. Some things only truly begin when every other light has been extinguished. And I, for the first time in my life, felt as though I had truly stepped into the rest of myself. It wasn't quite morning yet. A thick fog blanketed the lake, so dense that the pine trees on the opposite shore had vanished. I sat on the chair by the window, the phone in my hand. The numbers on the screen blurred from the moisture clinging to the glass. I dialed. Dorothy Hale, an old friend, a retired lawyer, the only person I trusted enough to call. The phone rang a few times. Then her voice came on, husky and warm. "Clara, are you all right?" I inhaled, answering quietly. "I am, if all right means having nothing left to lose." She said nothing more, just listened in silence. That was Dorothy's way of offering a hug from afar. I could picture her sitting in her paper-filled house, her eyes gazing out at her lavender garden. She was never rushed, especially when facing someone else's pain. I told her everything. About the evening, the argument, the signatures I now realized I had placed in the wrong spot. My voice trembled, but it didn't break. When I stopped, I could hear the rustle of papers on the other end, the gentle tapping of a pen against a desk. "Send me a copy of those papers from last year," she instructed. "I have them in the cabinet. I'll photograph and send them." 5 minutes later, I heard the notification chime. Dorothy reviewed every page. I imagined her eyes moving across the lines, sharp and calm, as if retirement had never dulled the edge of the justice within her. A few minutes of silence passed. Then she spoke, clear and decisive. "Clara, nothing has been filed with the county clerk. I just checked. Those papers you signed were internal drafts only, not officially notarized." I froze. "That means, legally, the house is still yours." Her voice was firm, like the sound of an iron door being opened from the inside. For a split second, I couldn't speak. Everything that had been squeezed tight in my chest for days felt instantly uncorked. I lowered my head, listening to my heart, beating slow, clear, and true. "Thank you, Dorothy." "Don't thank me. Just remember, justice is not a scream. It's patience." She paused for a beat, then asked, "Are you scared?" I looked out the window. the first light of dawn just beginning to pierce through the row of pine trees. "Afraid," I said, but no longer weak. After ending the call, I remained seated. My hands clenched the coffee mug for warmth, but my heart was cold, only now it was lucid. The heat from the coffee cup melted the layer of condensation on my fingers. I closed my eyes, took a deep breath, and clearly heard every small sound in the house. The wind squeezing through the door, the wooden floor expanding from the dampness, and the porch light slowly flickering back on after a long night. The golden light hit the corner of the table, soft and persistent, as if it knew I had just reclaimed a part of myself. I sat still for a while after the call ended, looking out at the still foggy lake. The morning light shone onto the now cold cup of coffee, creating a faint halo. In the silence, memories surfaced, layer by layer. The dinner, Amber's voice, Samuel's averted gaze, and the sound of the door slamming shut. I opened my phone again, typing a brief message to Dorothy. They betrayed me. On the other end, she replied within minutes. They taught you about boundaries. Just one sentence, and it stopped my tears. I read it over and over, then set the phone down. Perhaps it was true. Betrayal is not just a loss, but a mirror reflecting how many times we've allowed others to step over our limits. I realized my boundaries had been slowly eroded by love, by trust, by fear. And now it was time for me to redraw the line around my own heart. I stood up, walking around the house, looking at each object. Everything was quiet, too quiet. In the kitchen, the smell of old coffee blended with the damp wood, creating the feeling that I was in a place that had just been abandoned. On the table, the electricity bill was still there, folded in quarters. I didn't touch it again. I just whispered for myself, "Justice does not need to be loud." I decided to leave, without a fuss. No scene of weeping, no quickly packed suitcases. Just a woman calmly choosing to walk away from a place where she was no longer respected. I knew Dorothy would help me complete the legal filings, but the rest, the living part, I had to do myself. I sat down at the table, took a notepad, and wrote a title with slightly trembling handwriting, "Things to Take." I began listing them: passport, some cash, the leather notebook, wedding photo. Then I paused, looking out the window. Outside, the golden light of dawn was redrawing the shape of the house on the lake. I wrote again. First, the old porch light, the only thing I would not leave behind. I remembered my husband telling me, "As long as this light is on, we have a way home." Perhaps I wouldn't be coming back here, but that light would come with me, as a witness to the last time I dared to choose myself. I stood up and stepped out onto the porch. The light was still faintly glowing after the storm last night. I gently unscrewed it from the socket, holding it in my hand, feeling the thin layer of dust and the residual warmth. The morning breeze blew through, gently stirring my hair. To the east, the sun was just peeking out. I closed my eyes, took a deep breath, and clearly heard the whistle of the wind, the lapping of the lake, and my own heartbeat, steady, patient, and true. Then I turned my back and walked inside, the light of dawn stretching long behind my shoulder like a farewell streak. In the morning, the first sunlight seeped through the thin curtains, painting faint streaks of light onto the wall. I pulled out the old suitcase from under the bed. Inside, the scent of aged fabric and dusty paper mingled, a smell of time that no one could replicate. I packed the wedding photo, the journal, and the light bulb. Only 3 items, yet enough to narrate an entire lifetime. Few possessions, many memories. The photograph of my husband and me on our first snowfall in Vermont. The leather journal with the lines of blue ink smeared in the middle. And the old porch light bulb. I wrapped it separately in a wool scarf, like holding a small sleeping heart. I didn't need to take more. I had lived long enough to understand. When a person truly leaves, they don't need to take material things, only the things that remind them they were once loved. I walked slowly around the room, looking at everything one last time. The wooden chair where my husband used to read the newspaper. The curtain Amber called too old. The kitchen counter with Samuel's scratch marks from when he was a boy. Every mark was a memory, and I left them there, so the house could continue telling its story even after I was gone. When I pulled the suitcase into the hallway, the floor creaked softly. The sound echoed through the silent house like a quiet farewell. Passing their room, I paused. The door was slightly ajar, and the blue light from a phone screen shone out. Amber's voice floated out, light, quick, and flat. Yes, she should be gone this morning. A small, clear laugh followed. The comment that landed in my ear no longer felt like a knife. It was merely a stone dropped into the lake, creating a few ripples before vanishing. I gripped the handle of my suitcase tightly. No anger, not even pain. Only a quiet regret spread through my chest. What did I teach my son incorrectly? I whispered. Not to blame, but to understand. Perhaps I taught him how to care for others, but forgot to teach him respect. I taught him how to wait, but not that sometimes you have to know when to say enough. And worst of all, I taught him how to love without boundaries, the kind of love that had turned me into a shadow in my own life. I took a deep breath. The cold air from the hallway filled my lungs. The morning coffee smell mingled faintly with Amber's perfume, a familiar yet distant scent, like that of a house about to become the past. I looked around once more, my gaze stopping at the staircase, where small footsteps once ran up and down, laughter echoing throughout the house. Now there was only silence, a silence that was both heavy and clear, as if the house too was holding its breath, waiting for me to leave. I gripped the suitcase handle, turning my head around very slowly. Behind me, Amber's voice continued. Yes, she's leaving today. Don't worry, it's handled. The door closed between us, not with a loud slam, but with a distance that could not be mended. I stepped out onto the porch, still holding the light bulb wrapped in the wool scarf. The morning light shone through, making its glass reflect a tiny golden gleam, faint but proud. I paused at the threshold. The morning air was cold and clear as a freshly sharpened blade. The lake was still, with only a few wisps of silver fog lingering on the surface. I looked around the porch one last time, then reached out and flicked the porch light switch on. The golden light flared, soft and familiar enough to make my heart tremble slightly. It caressed the wooden steps, swept over the small cracks, clearly illuminating every grain of time my husband and I had left behind. Everything was silent, only the light was alive, like the house's last breath. I stood there for a long time. In that light, memories became clearer than ever. Samuel's childhood laughter, the smell of the baked goods my husband used to make, the sound of the piano I played on snowy afternoons. They all returned, not loud, not demanding, only to say goodbye. I bent down, placing the old light bulb gently into the suitcase. Then I spoke softly, my voice barely loud enough for the wind to hear. Goodbye, Samuel. Learn to live in the darkness you created. No bitterness, no anger, just an honest message. I understood that some lessons a child must learn with the very hands that hurt others, and I, the mother, could not save my son by allowing myself to continue sinking. I closed the door gently, without a sound. The old door creaked slightly and then stopped, just tight enough to keep the wind out, and just loose enough for the last light to seep through. That was the first time I left this house without looking back, without needing to know if anyone was standing in the window watching me go. Outside, the fog covered the path down to the main road. I pulled the wool scarf around my neck, placed the suitcase on the back seat, and opened the car door. When the engine started, the sound of the machine mingled with the wind, sounding like someone's heartbeat regaining strength after a long exhaustion. The car began to roll into the mist. Everything behind me faded, the roof, the wooden porch, the door frame, all dissolving into the thin white haze. I looked in the rearview mirror. The small porch light was still on, a golden dot in a sea of gray. I left it there, like a promise that I once had a place I belonged to, and that I was once brave enough to leave it. The wind was biting, my heart was light. A slow sense of freedom spread through me, not joy, but the simple peace of someone who has made their choice. I didn't know where I was going, only that the road ahead, though empty, was mine alone. As the car turned off the hill, I whispered, for no one to hear, "Goodbye, home. Thank you for everything." Then I turned on the radio. An old song played, a husky female voice singing about winters past. I smiled, easing off the gas pedal slightly. And just like that, I drove away from the house, no longer carrying fear, only the woman who had learned to switch on her own light in the dark. The road winding north through Vermont was mist-covered, carrying the rich, warm scent of pine resin. By the time the car stopped, late afternoon had settled. The thin sunlight filtered through the leaves, spilling in patches across the cabin's silvered roof. I had rented a small cabin, isolated deep in the woods, nearly 2 hours from town. The house was just one room, one kitchen, and an old wooden porch, barely enough space for one person and the sanctuary of her own thoughts. I opened the window. The breeze swept in, bringing the scent of pine sap, clean and wholesome, like an unspoiled memory. No sound of people, no cars, only the wind and the distant cry of birds. A quiet stillness, like a lullaby. I settled into a chair, letting the chill seep into my collar, and heard Dorothy's words echoing in my mind from the day before. Starting over doesn't require permission. Here, I felt like everything was starting anew. Even my heartbeat seemed slower, softer. On the first evening, I brewed a small pot of tea, turned on the reading lamp, and opened the leather journal I had brought from the old house. The paper was slightly yellowed, the ink still showed faint smudges, but the new pen was smooth, and my hand was steadier. I wrote the first lines hesitantly. The words appeared, then paused, broken off as if afraid to touch the pane. I stopped, looking out the window. Snow began to fall lightly, tiny flakes dissolving the moment they touched the porch. I wrote on. The lines became continuous, clear, even slightly sloped from the gentle tremor in my hand. Then the words poured out like melting ice. With every sentence I wrote, I felt a burden lift, as if each character was carving a path for a fresh breath. I didn't write about the betrayal, but about the light, the thing that stays when everyone else has gone. I wrote about the cold and how it forces a person to find warmth from within. I wrote not for anyone to read, but knowing that if anyone had ever hurt as I had, they would understand. One morning, before the fog had lifted, there was a knock at the door. A tall man with a silver beard and eyes as gentle as the pine forest filled the doorway. He carried a basket of red apples and offered a soft smile. "I'm Walter, your neighbor from the hill across the way. Just wanted to welcome you to the area." I took the basket. The scent of apples mingled with the cold air. "Thank you. It's truly quiet here." He glanced around the cabin, then smiled faintly. "Your light is on every night. I see it from across the lake." I smiled, my fingers still on the handle of the apple basket, just to remind myself that I'm still here. Walter nodded, his kind smile seeming to understand everything. He asked no further questions, just said goodbye and left, leaving behind the scent of pine and a strange warmth. I stood in the doorway watching him, the golden light reflecting on the morning fog, creating a small halo, just enough for a person who was no longer afraid of the dark. I whispered softly, as if speaking to the new house, "We'll be fine, just you and me." That afternoon, a strong wind blew through the woods, carrying a heavier scent of pine resin than usual. I opened the door, standing to look at the porch, which was covered in a thin layer of dust. On the old wooden chair, there was a power outlet already installed. I took the item I had kept safe throughout the long journey out of my suitcase, the old porch light bulb. It was heavier than I remembered. The glass was cloudy, the copper base scratched, and in some places it was still dusted with dirt. I gently wiped it with the wool scarf, then screwed it into the socket, tightening it firmly. The slight twist produced a click, a small sound that echoed deep into my heart. The light came on, a warm, golden glow, small yet true. I stepped back a few paces, watching. The light wasn't harsh. It spread just enough around the porch, hitting the wooden door and the misty window frame. It no longer reflected the tired face I had at the old house, but instead the image of a calm person, somewhat lonely but self-possessed. I touched the wooden wall, feeling as if I was touching a heartbeat. Everything here was rustic, rough, but honest. No one could turn this light off but me, and I knew I would switch it on every night, not to wait for anyone, but to remember that I was still here. When night fell, the wind blew through the cracks, creating a gentle murmur like someone whispering a lullaby. I lay in the small room, bringing nothing with me but a thin blanket and the slow, steady beat of my own heart. For the first time in months, I didn't have to wait for footsteps, the sound of a closing door, or any conversation. The first night, I slept soundly, a deep sleep, without dreams, without panic, without startling awake to search for someone's shadow in the darkness. The sleep of someone who no longer waits. When I opened my eyes, the morning light had already streamed in through the small window. The lake in front was steaming, creating a delicate layer of thin mist drifting slowly over the water's surface. I got up, brewed a cup of black coffee, and walked out onto the porch. In the morning, moisture rose from the lake, thin plumes, like smoke, wrapped around the pine trees. The sunlight hit them, making them shine like silk. No sound of cars, no sound of people, only the gentle breeze and the lapping of waves against the shore. I inhaled deeply the scent of freedom, an intangible smell, a mix of wood, mist, and sun, but it opened my lungs and lightened my head. I suddenly thought, perhaps freedom is not running away from someone, but learning to live in a place where you don't need to wait for anyone to come home. I took a sip of coffee, watching the light slowly spread across the lake. The porch light was still on, even though the day had broken. I didn't turn it off, because it was no longer a sign of waiting, but proof that I had endured and had chosen a start that was peaceful enough for me. In the afternoon, the weather turned to rain. The first drops tapped softly on the tin roof, a sound both familiar and strange, like a prelude to what was coming. I was folding towels when I heard a car stop outside the porch, followed by 3 knocks on the door, hesitant, faint, and weary. When I opened it, I saw Samuel. He was thin, unshaven, his eyes deeply sunken, like someone who hadn't slept for many nights. His jacket was crumpled, soaked through by the rain. In my son's eyes, there was no longer the confidence that had once intimidated me, only emptiness and exhaustion. "Mom," he hesitated, then lowered his head. "Amber left me. I have nothing left." I remained silent, not out of surprise, but because some things we sense for a very long time, yet dare not name. I stepped aside for him to enter. The smell of dampness, rain, and despair came with him. He stood in the middle of the room, like someone who didn't know where to sit. I pointed to the wooden chair near the fireplace. "Sit down, Sam. It's warmer here." I invited him to sit and poured tea. His hands trembled, the cup rattling gently on the porcelain saucer. The steam rose from the tea, but it wasn't enough to melt the coldness between us. I looked at my son, recognizing in his eyes the same kind of dissolution I had once experienced. When a person loses not only their home, but the illusion that they are in control of their life. He spoke quietly, his voice hoarse with fatigue. "I don't know where to start. She took all the savings, the car. I only have a few things left in my pocket." I didn't reply. I silently poured more water, placing the teacup back in front of him. The wind whistled through the door crack, blending with the crackle of the fire in the stove, the sound of those trying to keep living. I looked at my son, the one who had once slammed the table, who had told me, "Mom, don't interfere." Now he sat hunched over, his shoulders heavy, his eyes avoiding mine. A part of me wanted to embrace him, but another part knew that hugging him now would mean erasing the boundary I had painfully reestablished. I inhaled deeply, my voice calm. "Do you understand loneliness now?" I asked, without malice, without sarcasm, without triumph. It was just an honest question between two people who had once loved each other incorrectly. He looked up, his lips trembling slightly, wanting to say something but unable to. Outside, the rain fell harder. The sound was steady, sad, yet cleansing. Just like the truth, sometimes it comes late, but it always arrives. I didn't need to hear the answer, because sometimes a person's lowered gaze is enough to know they understand. Samuel bowed his head, his hands clasped together. I waited, not urging him, only listening to the steady rain outside, the slow ticking of the clock hands, and his breathing, broken, like someone learning to breathe again. Then he cried. Not loud sobbing, but the kind of cry that had been suppressed for a long time, wet and shaky. No excuses, no justifications. Only tears falling onto the back of his hands, slow, heavy, and real. I didn't offer a tissue. I let him wipe his face with his sleeve, like a man learning the simplest truth. When you hurt others, no one comes to wipe away your tears for you. A tear fell onto the table, spreading into a round stain, then disappearing among the old scratches. I looked at that stain, thinking of the countless times I had sat just like that, only back then, there was no one sitting opposite me. Finally, he looked up, his eyes red, his voice hoarse. "Mom, I'm sorry." I nodded gently. I didn't say, "I forgive you," nor did I say, "It's all right." Because there are some words that, if spoken too soon, lessen the lesson that must be remembered. We sat in silence for a while. The fire crackled in the stove. The tea cooled, all its steam gone. When he stood up, the golden light outside the porch was fading. He turned back, his voice small. "Mom, I'll be okay." "I know," I replied, "but being okay doesn't mean forgetting." He nodded faintly, then walked to the door. The wind rushed in with the rain, carrying the smell of dampness and ash. As the door closed, the room echoed with a long, drawn-out howl of the wind. I looked out. The porch light was flickering. The light pulsed like the weak breath of an old person. I put on my coat, stepped out onto the porch, tightened the connection socket, and whispered, "Shine on." The bulb steadied, the golden light radiated more evenly, illuminating the rain-wet wooden surface. A drop of water fell onto my cheek. It could have been rain or something else. I didn't wipe it away. Going back inside, I opened the leather notebook, sat by the window, listening to the wind sweep through the pine trees. The blue ink remained full in the bottle, the pen resting neatly on a new page. I wrote slowly, one stroke at a time. Pain is not for revenge, but for remembering who you are. I watched the words slowly dry. The ink dried quickly, no longer bleeding like before. Perhaps because my hand was steadier, or because my heart had stopped shaking. Outside on the porch, the light was still on. The rain fell lighter, tiny drops dissolving into the air. I closed the notebook, sighing, not out of weariness, but breathing out the heaviest thing in my heart. That night, I sat by the window for a long time, not waiting for anyone to come home, not hoping for anyone to knock, just watching the golden light reflect on the distant lake, a small dot in the night, but enough to know that I still existed. That morning, the sky was unusually clear. Sunlight spread golden over the dewy grass, and the lake sparkled like a mirror no one dared to touch. I was making coffee when I heard a car stop outside the porch. When I opened the door, Samuel was standing there, thin shoulders, a hesitant look in his eyes. "Mom, can I stay for a few days?" His voice was small, almost fearful. I didn't answer right away. I looked out at the backyard, where the grass had grown too high, and the lavender bushes were severely leaning to one side. "Yes," I said, "but there's a condition." He looked up. "What condition?" "Help me clear the garden. Here, if you want to stay, you have to work." He paused for a few seconds, then nodded, the first time he had complied without argument. Gone was the logical voice of the person who once thought everything could be explained by numbers or contracts. All that remained was the silence of a person learning how to exist again after losing everything. We went to the garden. The wind blew up from the lake, carrying the scent of fresh grass and damp earth. We cut the grass in silence. The steady snipping of the shears was like a heartbeat held stable by effort. No one spoke, but I knew he could hear his own quiet atonement in every stroke of the blade. Occasionally I glanced over. Sweat trickled down his temple, mingling with the grass clippings. The sunlight shone through, making his hair appear bright, thin, and fragile like dandelion seeds in the wind. I wanted to say something, but held back. A person who is learning sometimes needs silence more than comfort. The wind swept through the lavender, tilting the small purple blossoms. Their scent filled the air, pungent, soothing, and melancholic. I remembered my husband planting them at the old house, saying that lavender helps people forgive without forgetting. I looked at Samuel, and in that moment, I knew I had forgiven him, not with words, but by allowing my son to return as a stranger who was given a chance to start over. When evening came, he cleaned up the tools, wiped his sweat, and walked around the porch. The sunset light stained the door frame gold. I stood on the threshold, watching him place his hand on the wall, tentatively reaching for the porch light switch. His eyes asked, "Can I turn it on?" I stepped closer, my voice soft, but just loud enough for the wind to carry. "Turn it on when you're truly staying." He withdrew his hand, nodding faintly. Then he turned away, silent. The light didn't come on, but the late day sun cast a pale yellow over his face. Not the color of a light bulb, but of a small, opening opportunity. I watched my son's figure walk down the wooden steps, moving slowly through the freshly trimmed lavender bushes. The purple stalk swayed, shedding a few small petals, like a silent farewell wave. My heart was no longer heavy. There was only a delicate boundary that had been clearly, peacefully set, not to divide, but to protect both of us. Night fell quickly. The lake outside was black as an inverted piece of glass, faintly reflecting the sliver of the new moon. I sat by the window, waiting to hear the click of the switch on the porch. But throughout the entire evening, there was nothing. That night, the light didn't turn on. Only the firelight from the stove cast flickers on the wall, dancing like a lonely waltz. I knew Samuel was awake. From the small room at the end of the hall, I could hear his footsteps, short and hesitant, as if he were walking through his own fear. I didn't go to knock on his door. A mother sometimes has to learn to step back, to let her child face his own night. Outside, the wind rustled the pine trees, sounding like a distant, ancient whisper, a reminder that all mistakes have a price, and remorse, if genuine enough, will find its own way back to the light. I drifted off to sleep sitting up, until the first light of dawn slipped through the curtains. On the kitchen table, there was a folded piece of paper placed neatly next to the coffee pot. His handwriting, still leaning to the right, slightly shaky. "Thank you, Mom." No explanations, no promises, no further apologies. Just those 2 words. Enough. I read it, folded it, and tucked it into the leather notebook between the old stained pages. Every time I open it, I want to see those words, to remember that repentance also has a sound, a small sound, but as real as a breath in the early morning. I went to the door, looking down the dirt road leading to the lake. He was gone. The wet tire tracks were still imprinted on the grass. I stood silent, listening to the wind sweep through the lavender bushes we had cut the day before. His posture was no longer rushed. No running away, no looking back, no haste to prove anything. He left with slow, deliberate steps, with the weight of true regret. And in that slowness I saw the image of the man I had still hoped my son could one day become. I turned back into the house. There was no longer the emptiness of previous partings, only a pleasant stillness, like the moment you've just set a heavy weight down from your shoulders. I turned on the stove, boiling water. The sound of the water coming to a boil was steady, soft, and familiar. I made coffee, and I smiled. Not a smile to hide tears, but the smile of someone who has finally learned how to be alone without feeling incomplete. A smile unmixed with tears. There was only the rich scent of coffee, the early light spreading across the curtain, and the empty chair by the table. No longer sad, but only reminding me that silence, too, can be a form of peace. I looked out at the porch, where the switch still rested. Last night he hadn't turned it on, but inside my heart that light had already come back on, in its own way. It was a clear October morning, the sky as blue as freshly washed glass. On the table, the first printed copy of the memoir, The Porch Light, lay neatly. I touched the cover. The paper was rough, the tone a soft yellow. In the center was the image of a single golden light bulb on a porch, gently shining, casting a thin streak of light onto the wooden floor. There was no portrait of me. No need. The story wasn't about the face, but about the light one manages to keep after the darkness passes. I sat still for a long time, looking at the small font printed beneath the title. A story about leaving the light on for yourself. I smiled. A genuinely soft, quiet laugh, like a sigh. Perhaps I had come far enough to understand that the only thing that mattered was daring to turn the light back on, even if only to illuminate myself. A few weeks later, the book signing was held at the town's small bookstore. The room was filled with the smell of new paper and roasted coffee. Outside, a light rain fell, the drops tapping steadily on the glass roof, like the gentle rhythm of time. In front of me was a long queue of people, mostly women, some middle-aged, some with silver hair. Everyone held the book in their hands, open to the first page, waiting for a signature. From the line, an old woman approached. Her hair was white, her hands trembled slightly, and her eyes sparkled brightly behind thin-rimmed glasses. She placed the book on the table and took my hand. Her skin was cold, but her grip was firm and true. "I read it in my kitchen cabinet," she said, her voice hoarse. "I turned my light back on after 20 years. I couldn't speak right away. I just nodded, then squeezed her hand back. I imagined another house, somewhere else, with a golden light bulb that had just been turned on after all those years of gloom. Perhaps that night, that woman also stood alone on her porch, shivering from the cold but no longer afraid. And I understood. The light from this page had found another porch to rest upon. She smiled softly, then withdrew her hand, walking slowly away through the crowd. I watched her go, my heart feeling light and full, as if I had just received back a piece of warmth I had given away long ago. When the line was nearly finished, the bookstore employee invited me to the microphone to say a few words. The small room fell silent. All that could be heard was the tapping rain and the gentle movement of chairs. I stood, holding the note card in my hand, but then folded it away. No need to read from prepared notes. I looked around, at the silent faces, the eyes that had known loss, and I spoke slowly, my voice deep yet clear. "You don't have to scream to be heard. Just stand steady." No one applauded immediately. There were only deep breaths, small nods, and then a round of steady, warm, genuine applause. In that moment, I felt that my porch light wasn't just shining for me. It was spreading out, reaching those who hadn't yet dared to flip their own switch. The following afternoon, when I returned to the cabin, a brown cardboard box sat by the door. No sender name, just a card tucked beneath the ribbon. I carried it inside and opened it. Inside was a bouquet of purple flowers, still damp with dew, the scent of lavender faintly present, like a distant memory. The small card, with familiar handwriting, still slanting slightly to the right. "You won with quiet justice. D." I laughed softly. Dorothy. Only she would write like that. Brief, sharp, and straight to the heart. No wishes, no compliments, just a reminder that sometimes true victory needs no audience. Justice, in her eyes, wasn't the gavel slamming in the courtroom, but the moment you stood still in the storm, without trembling anymore. I took the small ceramic vase from the shelf, poured in a little water, and placed the flowers next to the window, bathed in the early light. The early sun slanted through the curtains, the golden light embracing the petals, making them glow like thin silk ribbons. The scent drifted into the room, mixing with the smell of coffee and book paper, a kind of peace I once thought I would never touch again in my life. I sat down by the window, opening it to let the breeze in. Each petal swayed gently, touching the light as if conversing with it. I thought of Dorothy, the one who taught me that sometimes silence is the clearest way to express dignity. If she were here, she would probably say again, "See, the world still bends toward the quiet ones." The afternoon passed slowly. The sun set late. When the darkness poured over the woods, I looked out at the porch, where the light had not yet been turned on. I left it alone. Tonight, I wanted the light to arrive on its own rhythm, without forcing it, without waiting for it. That night, the porch light came on late. No one flipped the switch, but somehow, it still shone. The golden light seeped through the curtains, shining onto the page I was reading, a stack of reader letters sent to me, clipped together in hand-addressed envelopes. I opened each one, reading slowly. One person wrote that they dared to leave their abusive home. Another said they had turned on the light in the room they had kept dark for 10 years to escape memories. Someone else just wrote a single line. I survived. I read until I lost track of time. Outside, the wind blew strongly. The lake murmured with waves, but I heard nothing but the sound of turning pages and the steady, low hum of the light above my head. In the middle of the night, I closed the letters, placing my hand on the cover of the porch light. The light reflected on the small, golden letters, tiny but enduring, like the warmth that still remains in this cold world. I turned off the reading lamp, but I didn't turn off the porch light, because, perhaps, tonight, someone is walking through another kind of darkness, and they need to see a light, however small, to know that there is still a way back home. I arrived at the Burlington Area Women's Center on an early winter morning. A thin layer of snow covered the roof, and thick mist clung to the window panes. The building was old, with red brick walls and a faded sign. But when I stepped inside, the first thing I noticed wasn't the cold. It was the smell of toasted bread and scattered laughter. Quiet, but genuine. I was here by invitation from a social worker who had read The Porch Light. She said they wanted me to speak to women who were starting over after long years of fear. I didn't know what I would say. I only carried my small notebook out of habit. In the corner of the room, I saw a woman older than me, small-framed, with straggly gray hair wrapped in a thick gray wool shawl. The social worker whispered, "That's Nora, 72. She just arrived last night." Nora looked up when she saw me, her eyes both guarded and bright. She walked toward me, her dry, rough hands clutching the worn, yellow-covered book. "I read your book in my kitchen cupboard," she said, her voice trembling. "I had to wait until my son was fast asleep. If he knew, I wouldn't be standing here." I looked at her, that frail woman carrying a lifetime of survival in her eyes. Unable to say anything more, I simply hugged her. A long embrace, silent, without attempting to console. The smell of cheap, honest soap. The smell of life, of people striving to keep themselves clean amid the filth of violence and fear. In that embrace, I felt my heart soften. No longer aching, no longer closed off. When we pulled apart, Nora held my hand tightly, like someone grasping the first railing after a long sinking spell. "I don't know what to do next," she said, "but at least now I know I can walk out the door without being afraid." I nodded, answering softly, "Sometimes, just standing in the light is a victory, Nora." In the afternoon, I stayed for the group meeting the staff called Starting Together. A simple name, but I liked it. The meeting room was small, with pale yellow walls, a few chairs arranged in a circle. In the center, there was a warm pot of tea, some cookies, and the scent of lavender, the fragrance I had brought from the cabin. Each person sat down as if trying to rediscover their own rhythm of breathing after years of living in silence. As I sat with them, I didn't see myself as a speaker. I was just another woman who had walked through the night, now sitting to tell them how I had learned to turn on my light. When the meeting began, the small room sank into silence. No one spoke immediately. All that could be heard was the ticking wall clock and the gentle steam rising from the tea. I looked around, tired faces, but with lingering hope, hands still trembling, but now clasped together. Then, someone spoke. The youngest woman in the group, just over 30, spoke of fleeing with her 2-year-old child in the middle of the night. Her voice trembled, but each word was like a sharp cut, severing the cord of fear that had once bound her. Next, a mother of 3 told her story of divorce after 10 years of silent endurance. One by one, they spoke, slowly, hoarsely, sometimes breaking off mid-sentence. I sat and listened, taking no notes, offering no interference. I only felt something in the air changing. Each story was a light bulb turning on, faint at first, then growing stronger. Light connecting to light, shining onto eyes that had been lowered for too long. One woman laughed amidst her tears, saying, "I thought I was the only one." Not anymore. That laugh spread, briefly, but enough to melt the thick layer of ice in the room. I felt as if someone had just opened a window, letting the sun in. When it was my turn, I stood up. I didn't hold a piece of paper, didn't use any prepared notes. I simply spoke in a deep, steady voice. The voice of someone who had traveled through the full circle of darkness and returned only to point out the direction of the light. "I only want you to remember one thing," I said. "Your light. Only you are allowed to turn it off. No matter what anyone says, no matter who tries to flip that switch, only you have the power to keep it shining." The room was silent for a few seconds. Then someone nodded. Another smiled. A hand reached up and turned on a small lamp in the corner of the room, an old lamp, with a yellow, faint but genuine light. And instinctively, I smiled too. When the meeting ended, they left in an orderly fashion. I stood by the door, bidding each person farewell, touching their hands lightly as Dorothy had once done to me. Outside, snow began to fall softly. The wind carried the cold air and the smell of burning wood from a distant fireplace. Beneath the streetlights, the snow fell in tiny white flakes, settling on their shoulders, on their hair. Everyone's coat was dusted with white fragments. I watched them walk away, small figures, but steady. Each person was a moving speck of light, carrying her own lamp through the winter night. I closed the door, my hands still warm from their grips. The golden porch light shone down onto the floor, spreading into a long streak. I quietly thought, perhaps the world doesn't need to be brighter. It just needs more small lights like these, enough for people to find each other in the dark. One early spring afternoon, as the wind carried the scent of melting snow and the sound of dripping water from the eaves, I opened the mailbox by the gate. Amidst the wet flyers and bank envelopes, there was a handwritten letter on pale yellow paper in familiar script. I recognized it immediately. Samuel. His writing still slanted slightly, with thick ink on the downward strokes, just like when he was a boy trying to mimic his father's hand. I sat down on the wooden chair on the porch, my hand trembling slightly as I broke the seal. The paper inside was neatly folded, and the first line stopped my heart. "I'm in therapy. I turned the porch light back on. To remember you." Nothing more. Just a few short lines, the handwriting shaky but straight, as if each character had to overcome shame to be written. I read it 2, then 3 times. In my mind, I saw the old house in Vermont, the wooden porch, the wind blowing through the pine trees, and the golden light I had kept shining, even when the whole world around me went dark. Now it was turned on again, not by me, but by the person who had once turned it off. I leaned back in the chair, listening to the wind sweep over the roof, cold but clear. There were no tears, only a sense of warmth slowly spreading from my chest. As if an old wound had just been covered with a thin layer of skin, not fully healed, but enough to no longer hurt when touched. I walked inside, retrieving from the shelf the porch light bulb I had unscrewed the day I left that year. The glass was still cloudy, but the light of memory it carried had never faded. I placed the letter next to the light bulb, letting the two touch like 2 fragments of the past finding each other after years of being lost. Then I plugged it in and flipped the switch. The light instantly came on, shining like a benediction. The golden glow cast a warm, soft reflection on the wall, the exact color of the afternoon I had left the old house. I sat down at the table, picking up a pen, intending to write back to Samuel. The paper was white, empty, challenging me to decide what to say after all those years of silence. But the pen hovered for a long time. Because some things, if written with the wrong word, would accidentally reawaken the storm that had finally gone to sleep. Finally, I wrote, "Be well." Nothing more. Not, "I forgive you." Not, "I'm proud of you." Because forgiveness is ceasing to let the past drive. It doesn't need to be declared. It just needs to be lived. I folded the paper, not putting it in an envelope, but placing it beneath the lamp, where the light touched the corner of the words. On the table, the shadows of the two letters overlapped, forming a single area of soft light, a light that belonged to no one, yet belonged to both of us. Outside, the wind still blew, but the sound was now a whisper, not a howl. I knew that somewhere, in another house, a man was looking up at the golden light bulb that had just been turned on, and in that moment, we were both illuminated, without needing to meet again. I sat by the wooden table for a very long time, watching the light spread over the two letters. Then, in a moment of stillness, I knew what I should do. I opened the drawer, taking out the old camera my husband used to use. The lens was dusty, but it still worked. I stepped out onto the porch where the golden light bulb was shining steadily, not too bright, not too faint, just enough to see the shape of myself in the window glass. I raised the camera and pressed the button. A small, crisp click sounded, like the final period of a long chapter. The photo appeared, only the porch frame, the empty chair, and the golden light shining diagonally onto the wooden floor. No person, no words, no voice. I knew that was the most truthful message I could send. I printed the photograph, placed it in a white envelope, and wrote Samuel's name in the corner. No other lines. I sent him back a photo of the lighted porch. No words, just the golden glow, because there are some things that no longer need to be spoken. Anyone who has walked through the darkness understands that light promises nothing. It only proves that we still exist. In the evening, I sat on the porch, listening to the wind change direction. That night, the wind passed over the porch with a steady sound. No whistling, no howling, just a low, warm, constant tone, like a steady breath. I closed my eyes gently, hearing the light bulb humming softly on the wooden roof. A new lullaby, sung by no one, just the sound of the world ceasing its resistance to me. I leaned my head back against the chair, the wool blanket covering my shoulders. In the darkness, the small cabin became a soft block of light, nestled in the silent woods. I didn't think about Samuel, nor any past mistakes. I only thought about the cold breeze on my cheek and the lingering scent of lavender in the air, the fragrance that had traveled with me through countless changing seasons. I slept deeply. My sleep was light, as it had been when I was young, without dreams, without startling awake. Only a faint image appeared, the lake in summer. The water was clear, the sun high, and a woman sat on the porch, smiling in the golden light. Not a memory, not an illusion, just the peace that was finally allowed to return after having been away long enough. Winter arrived in silence. There were no fierce shrieking winds, no sounds of sleet, just snow, falling steadily, thick, and soft like a white blanket covering the entire forest. In the morning, I opened the window. The cold air rushed in, touching my skin like 1,000 tiny needles, biting, but real. Outside, the pine branches bowed low under the weight of the snow. The lake was frozen solid, shining brightly like a mirror. Inside, the wood stove glowed red, the firelight casting orange streaks onto the wooden walls, outlining my figure sitting in the chair, a shawl draped loosely over my shoulders. My hands were chapped but warm. I rubbed oil into them, then smiled. Perhaps the body was also learning to adapt to this solitary season. On the table, the cup of coffee gave off a faint steam. I heard a sound from far away, the whirring of a coffee grinder from Walter's house. The sound was steady, patient, and old-fashioned, like the unchanging rhythm of life in this region. That sound pierced through the thick veil of snow, tapping into my morning with the simplest form of peace, the sound of the ordinary, enduring. I closed my eyes, listening, and realized I was no longer counting days, no longer waiting for letters, no longing for the sound of a car stopping by. Time passed by steam, by the crackle of burning wood, and the distant rhythm of the grinder. Small things, but honest. After lunch, when the light outside had softened, I walked toward the mirror. The glass was misty, reflecting my silhouette with cheeks flushed from the cold. I touched my face lightly, then stood straight, looking into the mirror, seeing a person who was once broken, but now radiant. Not the brilliance of youth, but a light earned through every long night, every fall, every tear that had finally stopped. I looked for a long time. The wrinkles around my eyes were no longer frightening. They were evidence that I had lived. My hair was grayer, but also lighter, as if no longer weighed down by memories. For the first time in years, I looked straight ahead, without flinching. The woman in the mirror smiled at me. Not the kind of smile you put on for others, but a genuine smile, slow, enough for the heart to catch up. I whispered softly, just loud enough for myself to hear. We made it. Then I turned away, opened the door, and stepped out onto the porch. The cold air filled my lungs, but instead of contracting, I exhaled, watching the white mist of my breath vanish into the air. The snow was still falling, but each flake touching my hair no longer made me shiver. Late afternoon. The sky was a solid gray. The snow-covered pine forest felt like a huge, thick blanket draped over the entire world. I sat by the table, the firelight from the wood stove streaming through the glass door, dancing on the open page of my journal. Outside, the snow continued to fall, slow and quiet, each flake dissolving the moment it touched the wooden step. I picked up the pen and took a deep breath. The last page of the journal had been waiting for me for weeks. I reread the old lines, the first trembling entries in the cabin, the one I wrote the night Samuel visited, and the one recording the meeting at the Women's Center. Each page was a season, each stroke of the pen a breath relearned from the beginning. I smiled, then wrote the final sentence of my journal. Lost in the dark, to learn to turn on the light. Only 7 words, but they encapsulated my entire journey. No one taught me to switch on the light. I learned by stumbling, falling, and fumbling my own way in the darkness. That light was not meant to illuminate the path for anyone else, but to remind myself, even in the deepest night, I could still choose to stand up. The pen rested. I sat in silence, listening to the snow softly tapping on the roof, the crackling of the wood fire, and the slow, steady rhythm of my own heart. Outside the window, night had fallen, and the sky deepened. I stood up, put on my wool sweater, and walked out onto the porch. The wind blew up from the lake, whistling past the wooden roof, wrapping around my shoulders, tangling my hair. Above me, the small light bulb, bracing against the wind's shriek, was still shining, a golden glow, trembling, yet resilient, as if it understood it was born to endure, not to dazzle, patient, like time itself. I stood there, hands tucked into my pockets, looking up at the lamp. The gust of wind intensified, snow swirled around, but the light did not go out. I gave a slight nod, as if greeting an old friend who had traversed all the darkest years with me. Then I turned back, closed the door, and returned to the table. On the page, the ink was dry. I looked at the final line again, simple, unembellished, with a slight slant. Nothing more was needed. I closed the journal. The sound of the leather spine snapping shut was small but final, like the last breath for a chapter of life, the closing of an old life. I placed the journal on the shelf, next to the old photo frame of my husband and me, and the second porch light bulb I had bought to replace the old one when it finally failed. Inside the cabin, the light still spread evenly, warm and true. Outside, the wind still blew, but instead of howling, it now only whispered. That night, I sat by the window, writing no more lines. I simply watched the snow fall and felt my heart, after all these years, finally settle, as still as a lake sleeping beneath the ice. Spring arrived like a promise kept. The snow melted, the ground softened, and the purple lavender clumps began to bloom around the porch. The scent soft, slightly sweet, carried on the wind. I set a long table out in the yard, covered it with a white cloth, and arranged a few old porcelain plates and the faded silver teapot from years ago. A few friends from the Women's Center drove up. Dorothy also arrived with a basket of pastries and her same kind smile. We sat and ate lunch in the gentle sunlight, amidst the gurgling sound of the creek downhill and the chirping of birds returning from the woods. No one talked about the past. No one asked why I was alone. We simply shared small stories. The new seeds planted in the garden, the neighbor's dog having puppies, or the coffee shop in town changing owners. I listened and smiled, a smile that didn't need to hide anything. When the wind blew, the lavender branches gently swayed, touching the legs of the table, their purple fragrance spreading over the ground. The air was warm, quiet, unpretentious, only the sound of laughter mixed with the creek, blending as if winter had never existed. After the meal, as everyone lingered over tea, a young friend asked me, half-jokingly, "Clara, are you afraid of being lonely?" I looked up, seeing the sunlight reflected in their eyes. The women who had once sought me out with tears, now bringing the peace of their own smiles. I answered slowly, softly, but with certainty. Loneliness is not as scary as living in the wrong house. The table fell silent for a moment. Then someone nodded, another smiled, and I knew they understood. Because home is not just a place with walls and a roof, but a place where we can breathe without fear. As evening approached, everyone cleaned up, departing one by one. The sound of their cars starting faded away, leaving a gentle stillness behind. On the table, a few fallen lavender petals lay, purple against the white cloth, like the final punctuation marks of a completed chapter of life. I stood alone on the porch and turned on the light. The switch clicked softly. The golden light slowly spread and then shone steadily. Not too bright, just enough to see that my hands were still warm. The golden light reflected in my eyes. I looked around. The wooden steps, the pine trees, the old chair. Everything was in its right place, and in that moment I understood. I was no longer waiting for anyone to come home. I had already arrived, a long time ago, in my own house, in my own life. I sat down on the wooden chair on the porch. The sun had softened. The sky glowed amber. The evening wind carried the smell of damp earth and the lingering scent of lavender in the air. Underneath the chair, Pop, the stray cat I had rescued last winter, had ceased his vigilance, now curled up beneath the chair, his back rising and falling with his breath. Each time the wind blew, his tail twitched slightly, then relaxed again. The breathing was steady, a small sound, but enough to make this porch feel as if another heart was beating here with mine. I gently leaned down, stroking his back. His mottled gray fur, once matted and tangled from hunger and cold, was now smooth and warm. Pop cracked his eyes open, then rubbed his head against my foot, letting out a faint meow, a sound just loud enough to break the silence, preventing it from turning into loneliness. In the distance, the Vermont lake stretched out flat and calm, reflecting the sky as it faded to purple. I stood up, leaning my hands on the railing, looking at the water. The remaining ice floes were melting, slowly, like someone erasing an old wound. The lake surface shimmered, and in that moment I saw my reflection. Not blurry, not broken, just the person I am now. Light, peaceful, enough. I looked at the lake and smiled, a smile that needed no reason, directed at no one, simply because I was here, in the stillness of my own life. I was no longer waiting for anyone to come home, no waiting for letters, no waiting for the sound of a car, no waiting for an apology. Those who had left stayed behind in the old chapter. As for me, I had walked out. I sat back down. Pop nestled against my feet, and the porch light came on as darkness fell. The golden light spread across the wooden floor, illuminating the streaks of purple lavender still clinging to the steps. The space was silent, with only the faint chirping of insects among the pine trees. Then my voice, slow, low, and deep like a concluding voiceover, not for anyone to hear, but for myself to remember. If you think it's too late to start over, turn your light on. The light doesn't ask how long you've been lost. It just needs you to dare to touch the switch. I looked up at the porch light. That light, after all the seasons of wind and snow, was still as whole as the first day, no longer a symbol of waiting, but of coming home. Pop shifted his position, curling up tighter, breathing deeply. I closed my eyes, listening to the wind sweep through the pine trees, the scent of lavender still lingering around the porch. A chapter of life closed, not with a slamming door, but with the peaceful breath of the present moment. I used to think that when my child turned their back, it meant my life was over, but it turns out sometimes you have to lose everything to understand what is enough. I am no longer afraid of the dark, because it was in that very darkness that I learned how to turn on the light, and understood that the light has never come from anyone else but myself. If this story resonated with you, let me know. How did you have to turn your own light on? And if you want to hear more stories like this, please hit subscribe so that every time a new light comes on, you'll be the first to see it.